So today I'll have a chat and show you something about exposing GraphQL is all the rage. The thing is, how do you expose this in a controlled manner, right? And that's what the talk is about. We'll start with a super short intro on GraphQL, but there we go. So what analysts say, this is what Gartner says. You can see that GraphQL, everyone is talking about it, right? Because it's like at the top of the hype cycle. And every so often we go through this with all new technologies. And then we'll get disappointed a bit that it's not magic. GraphQL is not going to solve all our problems. It's unfortunate. And then we slowly start to get some adoption, and then it sees traction in the world. One of the drivers behind GraphQL is like self-service access. So rather than you having to make an API for everyone that wants a specific piece of data, you almost model the data that you want to expose, and then people figure out themselves how to consume it. And then one of the key obstacles to adoption is the security governance, performance optimization practice are still being developed. So that means that although the technology is great, there is some problems with how you're going to expose what and who's going to have access to what, that there is some thinking around that and technologies around that have not been finalized. So basically, that is what Gartner says. What is GraphQL? As you probably know, or maybe not, you say, this is what I want for data, give me all the data back, and then the server side gives you the data in the same structure back that you requested it, with all like the nested data that you potentially have, right? So in the request that you see here on the screen, like this is the Star Wars API, just like as a demo use case, you can find it online. I get all the films, and then, let me take a mic. I get all the films, and then from all the films, I want to get all the vehicles, and then I want to also have all the species for a specific film. And then from that species, I want to get the persons, and I want to get the name and the gender. So it's quite nested. You can obviously think that this is like hundreds of GET requests, right? Because first, normally we get all the films, like fetch them all, and then fetch from all of them all the details, and then so. The downside of that it might be a bit load heavy on your backend. But why GraphQL is also quite simple. If you look at like a network constrained environment, on the left we see like a non-GraphQL request for websites that wants to render something, and it ends up being way over fetching data that the web page doesn't need, and it ends up being like in 24 requests. And on the right side, we render the same web page, but just with one request and significantly less data. A couple of pros and cons. This is an amazing slide with a lot of text on it, but as a reference, it's good, right? Excuse me. Right. So one of the nice things of GraphQL, no overfetching. Great advantage. Client gets the data that he needs. Strongly defined data, so before people get data, they can look at the schema and know what they gonna get, which format, which is like also there with Swagger, but not every like interface has this. And then one of the nice advantages that people don't always necessarily think about is you can change the API without having to talk to your consumers. So imagine that you wanna add an extra field, or like change the format of a field. You don't need to, in advance, have that much back and forth with the consumers, because you can just put in maybe an extra field and then deprecate an old field, and then they get the SDL, like the defining contract, all the time, and then from there they can see that that is going to happen, and you can just make your changes dynamically. There's a couple of companies that are thinking about, rather than having a bunch of individual endpoints, just having like one massive endpoint. So they orchestrate all their endpoints together where all their data sits, and then you'll be able to fetch everything from that. A couple of disadvantages, like caching, very difficult, because you don't know, even though you go to the same endpoint, the return might be completely different based on the request that you make. There is a bit of complexity and new skills to be developed based on people need to understand the queries that are there with GraphQL. And securing certain parts of the API is more complex. Like they're like, what if you want certain data access for certain people? That is something that you need to think about. Right. Why API management for GraphQL? So the idea of API management is to solve those things. So in an API management solution, I mean, I'm talking about API Connect, which is ours, but there is other people also thinking about this. The idea is that certain things are offloaded from your backend, right? So for example, you want to secure, or you want to avoid that people fetch a huge amount of data without thinking what they're fetching, and offload your backend a little bit. And you want to also think who might have access to which piece of the API. That's the idea. Under. Nice. We get a notification. Cost. So yeah, that's a common problem. I did that yesterday. Thanks. So costing. What we did is we added type costing. So if you look at this slide, turning behind a little bit, you can see here we give every node a weight. So maybe it's more expensive for us to like get credit card information because we need to get it from like another backend, or the backend has like, we implement with a third party, and so it's more expensive for us, therefore it's more expensive to the customer, right? So we give all the fields like a cost. So when people call us, we can say this API query is gonna cost us X amount of points, let's say, and we weigh all the types, and then the sum of your entire request ends up with being the cost that you want. Field cost, a little bit of the same principle, but now rather than for entire types, just for a specific field, we can add weights to it. So that, for example, something that is stored in like a DB in a different geo costs us a little bit more than a backend that is really good at this. And sensitive data, we have the encryption back and forth for everything that we need to return to them from REST, so it's a little bit more expensive to us. So people don't end up fetching like 1 million records of all the people's home address, something like that, right? A second thing is reducing the size that people request. So a list could be huge, could be like millions of items. So rather than, list size, you see an argument that we added in the specification. This is also pushed in the public specification, by the way, but we add slicing arguments. So we say first, last, and the sized field are the edges. And then with your request, we enforce that you say, this is the first node I want to get, and this is the number of the last node, like the integer or whatever, of the last node that I want to get. Rather than fetching all 1,000 of them, I maybe only fetch like, for this one page I render 20 items on. I only fetch the first 20, and if someone changes the display field to like 100, I fetch the first 100. That people start to think about how much they're fetching. If they, every time we render the first 10, every time overfetching all 1,000, it's like expensive to us. Sender pattern, so for example, relay and pagination, this is really where this is useful in. The directive arguments are like slicing arguments and sized fields that you could just put in the SDL, and then the consumer of that GraphQL graph can know what he needs to add. Then list size, the assumed size. So rather than we saying when you don't define anything, you don't define the first and last, we don't want to do that, or not force people to do that. We just say we have an assumed size, and here we say the assumed size is 5. And if people don't define the cursor, we just return the first 5. And if people say, I want to be like at position 10, we do from 10 to 15. So we assume the size that the consumer wants to fetch. Then there is the list size. Excuse me, I'm gonna cough a little bit. You always got to love the conference sniffles, right? Good. The absolute limit, no slicing argument, and no connection patterns. So we say The assumed size is like 5, and the sized fields is edges. Why do we have sized fields in there? Oh yeah, good that I wonder myself. So you might have a node which is like film, but in film there might be like a subnode. Often we have like edges, for example, and then the films themselves you'll see in the graph, where why is there, for example, edges? We do that because we want to have like a cursor positioning graph to like move around, but it's not really a property of the film. So when we do the counting of the assumed size, we define what field we want to do the counting on. I'll get more clear like in a little bit of an example. Right. In this example, 5 fields will be returned unless there is less in the DB, and you could define where you want to start. And then the remove pattern. So the remove pattern is similar to what we've seen before. Also an extra directive we added to GraphQL, and it gives you the capability to remove certain sections. So based on scope, let's say, or based on a specific client, he can or cannot fetch a specific type. Like let's say he might be able to fetch films, or he might be able to fetch species, but not their gender. And you can define based on a bunch of parameters that we have around the consumer, around their subscription, around their client ID, around the scope of the token, around anything, that we don't allow, or we do allow specific consumers to that we do allow or do not allow specific consumers to like fetch specific data. And the directive argument there is remove. Now I'm going to show you this. Right, so this is API Connect, and we're going to add a new API. I'll show you. So we see, we want a graph API. So I define it as a graph proxy, and it's going to ask me to give my graph SDL. I'll give it a good name. Now I need to look up the schema. So this is like one of the public APIs that is out there, but you can just use any API. You need to give it a good name. Let's do it like this. Press next. Then it's already gonna do a lot of warnings, and it's gonna ask me a couple of questions. Like, do I wanna have the graph editor on there? Yeah, we definitely do. Like, do we want to support standard introspection? And then we add an additional endpoint called costs. It's for you to assess beforehand how expensive the query you are going to make is, so you don't have to analyze it. Although I am not touching anything, there is something magic going on with the screen. Right. It's gonna now do some generation. And if we go to the GraphQL schema, right, it gives me like 8 warnings. And what the API management tool here does is it's going to suggest things that might lead to backend problems. So in its current form, this API is unrestricted, and anyone can fetch anything and can fetch huge requests. So what it does is, different mic. What it does is for all of the root, for example, it says here, root films, recommendations, add to root films slicing arguments. So it says, okay, if you don't define this, you can fetch infinite films. If you don't define this, there is no slicing argument. Let's scroll to something more interesting. Here it does the same for people, and it figures this out for all of them, right? We can apply all of them, but we can also look, let's just apply all of them now. Gives me everything is going to be applied. the magical screen does something again. Good. It's also weird that it's like not totally away, it's just that the resolution changed a wee bit. And now every type has a weight, and we can give all other weights according to what we think is useful. And if we were to open Films Connection, and we were to go to Films, we could give it, like we discussed before, we could give it like a, why? We can give it like a field weight, an assumed size, slicing arguments, and a sized field. That is so far everything here, but there is this extra field where we can do, this is the remove statement. So, based on the JSON ATA query that I put in here, I can allow or not allow certain people to access certain fields. If I publish this API, imagine I already did in the background, someone that wants to consume my API is going to come to my developer portal where all the APIs are, including my graph APIs. Is the screen in the meantime having a stroke? I'm going to like give this a little shuffle just to see if it makes any difference. Now I need to find my user. There we go. And that user is going to go through the journey of consuming my API. For now, we bundled it in an automatic product, right? But come back to that. So now my API exists in the bundling, and I can see that for the API that I have here, there is a bunch of security options, like all the possible scopes are defined here. And when people want to try it, it needs my API key and my API secret. This is, yeah. And it gives us the GraphQL editor. And the GraphQL editor, it gives us also like insight in like the schema and what is going to happen exactly. Now, this is the standard automatic product that people have, and it's going to be used to fetch things. So I'll already do like a pre-fetch now with like some sandbox credentials. Yeah. This is Insomnia. It's like Postman, but a little bit different. So I define a bunch of requests here with like a node, the last field, the first field, what I want to fetch, like the last 100 apparently. And I put some vehicles in there, and then I do a request. Great, and I get all this nested information back. Now, what's interesting is that under the covers, well, not under the covers, here I am doing a bunch of, I'm doing a token call to get a token that contains the data types that I want to get. So if I were to remove vehicle from my request, get a new token, and I do another fetch, it's going to throw a hissy fit, right? It's going to say, no, you can't do vehicles because it doesn't exist. It does exist, it just doesn't exist for this consumer because it doesn't have the right scope. So far, the security aspect of it, so easily doable. And the second aspect is, now we want to have some sensible choices, and we want to say, no, actually, we now want to reduce the consumption that people are able to do, and we're going to give them this bucket of points every so often. So I'm going to quickly toggle this API offline. And we bundle the API. In API Connect, we bundle all the APIs in something called API products. It's just a shared concept where you are consuming or subscribing to that product, which gives you access to all the APIs, and also you're consuming from the rate limit that is that product. So it can be multiple bundled at once. In the plans that we have here, so we added the Swappy API, and then we'll add a plan. We'll say limited. It will not require approval, and we don't need rate limits or burst limits because it doesn't make sense. And then we can say, right, what GraphQL, the cost is going to be, what the design request is going to be like the cost is 5 per 3 seconds, and not unlimited. The field cost can be unlimited, and the type cost can be unlimited in this case. I'm not touching anything, please.
This is the GraphQL track, right?
Yeah. We have some weirdness with the screen going on, but you'll live through it, unless you get a stroke. I mean, well, we'll reanimate you. Yeah, if you suffer a lapse. So, with this, we define the rate limit that a consumer can get through this product with that GraphQL, so we can't get the unlimited amount of calls. So we say, yeah, that's great. We'll save the product, and we'll publish it. Publish it in the sandbox. We just have to publish it somewhere. Great. It's good that you guys are still laughing, because on the inside I'm secretly dying. To give it a second, maybe it's not here yet. How did I name the product actually? So I named the product GraphQL, good. No, not good. Let's do this. Is it alphabetical? Let's see. Just like this. The portal sometimes takes a couple seconds for it to show up. Well, like even half a minute if we're not lucky, but. It's gonna take more than half a minute, is it? I'll just republish it. Did I maybe only stage it? No, I didn't. I'll just do a publish again. Sandbox. Next. Let me just. Right. Here we go. This is always the problem with live demos and a portal that decides when it's sensible to do synchronization. Can't trust technology. That's okay, we got backups. So a subscriber would go through a subscription journey. We might see it back in a minute. And then he would only be able to pull a certain weight for a specific query, right? Let me add vehicle back in here so that he can refetch. I need to switch to API back online. Not open my email. Yeah. Boop. Give it a second. Yeah. Cannot find a subscription. That'll take a second for it to work. The URL token at least works. Good, we can fetch at least. Sometimes not. You can have a look, but yeah. Right, so imagine that I want to prepare my request and I don't want to overburden my bucket rate limits, because I can only do 200 points with the weight cost that we saw for all the fields before, right? So for the people that came in a bit later, we gave in all the fields a weight. So rate limiting doesn't make sense. You can do 100 API calls, but I can make one API call that has like the same impact on my backend as like 5,000 REST calls. So what we do now is we given like a defined maximum and minimums you can fetch, and also we give you a rate limit of like, let's say, 1,000 points. And the sum of your query that you do results in the amount of data that you can fetch. So if we do a fetch here to this cost endpoint that is automatically generated, it says that my request is going to have like a total cost of 2,035 on field cost and an impressive 102,152 on type cost, and then it gives me all the type costs and all the fields. If I were to, for example, change this to 1, much cheaper. And so we want to make sure that developers are able to check beforehand what the impact of the queries is going to be against the rate limiting, while at the same time not overfetching us. And so people start to think about how much they can fetch from the backend. And that remove statement helps us to then remove certain pieces of data for certain consumers. Let me in the meantime see if I can do the subscription journey in our portal. No, sadness. I can show you another API, right? So if a subscriber, I think this is also GraphQL. If a subscriber were to subscribe to an API, it would select the plan, which has 100 calls an hour, and normally then it would also define how much rate limits they have. This is an unlimited plan. Select your application. You create applications that give you client ID, client secret. Then you do next, build application, show next, and then done. You just subscribe. And with those credentials that you have from creating that application before, you can then either use that client ID to do against the rate limit. But the more complex example that we have here is, rather than just sending a client ID in the headers, I send in my token. And I combine two things here, right? So I combine my rate limiting capabilities in the gateway with forcing you to slice and forcing you to have like a limited amount of API calls. And at the same time, I am using the capabilities of OAuth, where only the fields you can fetch are dependent on the scopes. So if I were to, in this gateway, change, for example, let's remove like the last argument. It already says no. Yeah, also the syntax as well. That doesn't help. But you must provide exactly one of first or last values to the field vehicle connection. And so rather than doing the backend fetch, we are looking at the request, and the analysis is done based on the incoming request, never goes to the backend if it doesn't adhere to our spec. And I'll do like it. And for that, so that is based on like the limiting of fields and the rate limit we consume from the rate limit. And then if we remove person, let's say from our token that we get, and we do fetch here, it'll say can't find person, because when it comes into my API gateway looks at this request, and then actually in its mind, doesn't have a mind, but in memory, it'll say for this incoming request with no person scope in the token, it will not allow you to do that fetch. So in short, that's all I have to show, but now I'm open for discussions. Anyone has any questions? The idea basically what I showed you here is that API management unloads the responsibility of the backend to, this happens definitely also without me touching it, right? Okay, good. And also it unloads the responsibility of the backend of thinking of that rate limiting and protecting itself when you're exposing it to the outside world. And it also gives you that fine-grained control of who is going to get access to specific pieces of data. So the entire SDL, the entire graph is exposed to my gateway, and then the gateway to the outside world exposes a slightly altered version of that. So we can remove things, and we can force people to make sensible choices in their queries. This costing specification is written, I think, by a year and a half ago or 2 years maybe ago by a colleague of mine, but has been brought into the open source community. So people can look at the GraphQL cost specification. And more, I think more and more people start to adopt it. I think there is like another 2 or 3 people actively looking into it. The people that looked at this first, but there wasn't any standard mechanism of it, I think were Shopify, because they already had this issue. So it's definitely an issue that people need to look at, like how do I need to protect my backend? It's just that I think the adoption of GraphQL is not at the point yet where everyone has thought about it. So any questions or like any remarks or any thinkings? Yeah, I can give you a mic, I think. Yeah, I can give you this mic.
Yeah, so you're talking about, excuse me, a standard that lets GraphQL API express like the cost for a query, and that so you're in order for your API management to do rate limiting based on that, the GraphQL API must follow that particular standard.
Yeah, it's within an existing SDL, an existing like a standard definition. We just made a couple of extra directives in it, which is like extendable, so that's fine. And then everyone that can understand these directives, our gateway being one of them, that gives an indication that this field has such a cost. Of course, we understand that in the beginning it's quite complex to understand now how, like you're not going to manually calculate in your development cycle how much the cost is. So we have this cost endpoint where you could just send the query that you would send to that graph endpoint, and it'll just return you the cost, and it'll explain you why something costs this much. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the idea is rate limiting. You can rate limit on like the node size, the amount of nodes that you have, the field size. So based on the amount, so you can give certain fields. Let's say, for example, it's personal information that we store encrypted, and there is a quite heavy crypto cost to fetch that information back, or you have information and some information is on cold storage. It takes you a bit of time and a bit of cost to pull it back to warm storage so you can return the answer, like pseudo cold and pseudo warm, right? So it's like a couple seconds maybe. But that has a cost to us. So you could say, no, these fields, they're expensive. And so if you fetch them, you can't fetch that much in an hour if you want. And yeah.
But how do you give the gateway that information so that it knows the weights of the different
Yeah, I'm going to show you. So in the gateway, let me just re-import an API, right? Let me put this mic aside. So it'll build the API based on an SDL. So I'll import the SDL. Let me copy this again. Next. You can already see the warnings, but let's go through it. So first of all, the gateway, like all the policies that need to happen, they get constructed so you could do GraphQL in the query and GraphQL in the payload, and it builds like a whole bunch of policies and like that need to happen in the background. But that's automatically generated. You could alter the behavior, like if you for some reason need to alter the behavior. For example, there is one of the most common graph open source frameworks has a problem with compression requests. It just doesn't handle it like it should, so you need to disable compression. But then if you look at the GraphQL schema, right, and we can view the source, it gives me the entire GraphQL schema, but I could say, let's view the warnings. It'll make suggestions. I'm gonna just apply them all so I can quickly show you some. So it's gonna say sized fields, edges. So it means that if I wanna fetch all films, edges are going to be counted, and I need to define first or last, and then the number that I wanna fetch. The magical screen is gone for a second.
I think that answers my question, actually. I saw that thing. Thanks.
Yeah, and then you can put weights on all of it.
Yeah, awesome.
Actually, although I think the weighting is neat, I think it solves definitely a problem in rate limiting. I think there is more power in the remove directive, right? Where the remove directive allows you to remove certain field types out of the schema based on maybe your subscription level or like your token or like anything that's available in the context of the API gateway. That I think that is a more powerful concept. I think this is also a more difficult challenge to solve. I think the rate limiting makes sense, but I think most organizations don't have a graph interface at the moment where the costing is that problematic for them, because I think consumption is early. Like I think we're early in this journey. I think Facebook is quite successful. Shopify, you can see quite a bit because in mobile apps. And the question is also like, when you expose your Graph API to the outside world, I don't think that is something that is necessary for every organization, right? Some people just have a Graph interface or Graph API for their internal application, and that's fine. And you can think, oh no, they're gonna act sensible, right? There are internal guys, and otherwise I'm just gonna go to their desk and shout at them a little bit. And it's also rate limiting, but not in the gateway. But I think once you start to have like a platform, like if you are an API provider and you wanna be a platform rather than just your own internal company and wanna say, look, this API, like the Shopify guys or the Facebook guys, other people are going to do the heavy lifting of building the applications, and we're just the data providers, then I think it makes sense. Yeah. Anyone else want to say something, want to ask something? No. Good, that's it. But feel free to come by for a chat or like a demo. Ah, yeah. So I demonstrated this on I need to say this, otherwise I get slapped. I demonstrated this on our SaaS offering of API Connect. If you just, it's on AWS, we run API Connect as SaaS, and you could start from, I think you can, no, I know for sure you can do a 30-day trial for free, and it's pretty cheap to start off with. Like if you want to look at an API management solution or look at the capabilities that I showed here, then feel free to give it a go. At the booth, we have like a little QR codes you can scan to get the free trial. But if you Google, you'll also find it.